This session was originally presented at the November 2011 Open Identity Exchange Conference on Attribute Networks. So we're going to talk about some of the financial, specifically business challenges of trying to get stronger authentication of users. But to start off by this, we need to find some terms of the different people involved in this. So one of the terms that's common is the idea of an identity provider. This is most commonly known from circumstances where you might go to a website, see the button of another company like a Google, Facebook, etc. And if you click it, that other company provides lots of information about you. They authenticate you. They provide information about you. They get your consent to share information with the site. They basically do everything for you. And so it's not common for lots of companies to say, wow, I want to be one of those. I want to do everything. And more importantly, I want my brand's button on lots of websites. Now then, there are other companies whose specialty is more that they know specific information about the user. They know their street address. They know whether they're a paying subscriber to a particular TV channel. They know if they're a graduate of a specific college, etc. And so they feel that, oh, my information is more valuable than that identifier, so my company should be the button on the website. Now then you run into circumstances where a website needs information from two different attribute providers. So now all of a sudden you need buttons for the different ones. And then finally you run across companies who feel their specialty is authenticating users with something stronger than password. And they say, well, that's what happens when you go to a website and click a button. You're getting authenticated. So my company should be that button. So it's challenging. You have all these different players, and because of terminology, things can get very confusing. They feel like there's only one term, identity provider. But imagine them in the future, if a user went to a website and clicked the sign in button, imagine this is what they see. We refer to this as the account user. You can learn more about this at other sessions or accountuser.com. And you notice here, there are no identity provider buttons. The buttons is the user's picture. So the user's identity is themselves. It's a very different experience, but one that's obviously more friendly to the user. So then all of a sudden the value of your brand's button showing up everywhere is not as high. Similarly, many of us have started to encounter screens like this one. We're asked to consent to share information from one site like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. to another site. But at the end of the day, the user, it's actually information about them. It's generally their information being shared. They don't particularly care who shows this screen. They just want to know what information is being shared with the other website. For example, here that other website gets access to their email address. That might come from their email provider, but also their street address, which might come from potentially someone else. But it's easy for the user to see the list of that information and make a simple yes or no decision. So then the question becomes, okay, who showed this screen to a user if the user is consenting to share information and services from multiple different sources on the internet all to a single website? And then, of course, we showed these pictures of a user that are clicked, we showed this consent page, but what we didn't even show was how was the user authenticated? Was it a password or something else? So here we want to talk about a different type of terminology and introduce the concept of a relationship manager. The goal of a relationship manager is to learn about the different companies that have verifiable attributes about a user, such as their street address, their email address, their age, their citizenship, etc. They also know about what the user's popular service providers are, where the user's photos are stored, their address book, their mail, documents, etc. Once a relationship manager has that information, they can be in the business of showing that consent page that we showed before. The user just gets a list of attributes and services that one single website wants, and even if those attributes and services come from multiple places, that single page could get the user's consent to share information. And similarly, the user might visit that relationship manager to review and revoke that consent in the future. So the power here is the relationship manager can list attributes and services from multiple different places, and it's still just a single consent mechanism for the user. Now that's a great theory, but then it becomes a question of, well, who's going to authenticate the user so that the relationship manager knows who's at the browser. The relationship manager could certainly do it on its own, but they could also let the user specify a different company who does the authentication. So, this relationship manager, very important for privacy to get to user consent, but it raises the question, what poor sucker wants this job? What's the value in it when it's sort of connecting a user from one website to lots of other websites? And to be honest, the user doesn't necessarily care about the brand of the relationship manager. They care about the brand of the site they're logging into, and maybe the brands of the attribute providers and service providers. But if we use this model, and instead of an identity provider being one company that manages relationships and knows all your attributes and provides all your services and handles all of your authentication, we now have split it up into different pieces. A user has a relationship manager. The relationship manager, the user is then connected to their different attribute providers and their different service providers. And one of these special attribute providers is the one who authenticates them and proves they are actually the owner of the account. So this generates a different type of terminology that gives us more flexibility in how we view things. So let's now jump to the authentication manager if we assume this model exists, where there's a relationship manager, attribute providers, service providers, line parties. We already raised the question, who wants to be the relationship manager? But this other question is, who wants to be the authentication manager, especially if the different roles are split? And very specifically, what we want to talk about is what's the economic incentive to be an authentication manager? Well, the economic incentive usually involves money. So then comes the question of, all right, who's going to pay the authentication manager? And there are 4 different models we're going to walk through here, whether the user pays, the relationship manager pays, every website pays, or individual websites pay a central attribute provider. So the first option is that the users would actually pick their preferred authentication provider and pay them directly, maybe $100 a year. There have been many startups in this space. Not many of them are around. They have a very short half-life. There are certainly very sophisticated users who would be willing to pay for this, but generally speaking, there has been no success in this space in the consumer market. Now, the other suggestion is, well, the relationship manager should pay the authentication manager to authenticate the user. For example, you may have noticed that some large consumer websites like Google, Facebook, even World of Warcraft, for example, are starting to use stronger authentication involving things like codes sent to your phone. And, honestly, just sending those SMS messages, building that technology, having help desk, does cost money. So one option is that, these big companies that are maybe in the role of relationship managers getting your consent, they may also either run the authentication systems or pay to run them. And so, do you think that Google, Facebook, etc. is going to pay $100 per year just to strongly authenticate the user? I'll leave that question unanswered. And it then brings up another one. Even if they did incur all that cost, would they then help the users log into websites and for free tell those websites, oh yes, we've strongly authenticated the user, and provide all that value with no economic return? Again, I'll leave that unanswered. Another option is every single website builds its own authentication scheme, and many of them build a very strong authentication stream. So you might go to World of Warcraft and set up an OTP mechanism, and same with PayPal and AOL and Amazon Web Services, and all of a sudden you have lots of these physical tokens generating codes, or lots of software apps on your mobile phone that generate codes, and all in all, users want to shoot themselves in the head. Very painful. There's been talk about using things like shared, generators of these OTP codes, but experience has shown that that doesn't significantly help either. So another model is the idea that every individual website that a user goes to pays the attribute provider whose specific attribute is that they authenticated the user. And that was one of the main discussions of this Open Identity Exchange conference that was given in November 2011. But let's assume for a moment that model is a good idea. Now the question becomes, what websites would be willing to pay someone else to know that the user is strongly authenticated? fortunately, they're quite a lot. For example, there are all the websites who already today are trying to incent their users to use strong authentication and either find it difficult or expensive to get them to use it. And for some of them, they only have a few set of users using it, and so they may find there's just increased adoption if they offer more usable options that come from another specialist in this area. Or maybe they get lots of people to use it, but these authentication providers can do it cheaper, either cheaper fixed costs, cheaper ongoing costs, etc. And so, here are just examples of sites that have shown interest in requiring strong authentication. Online gaming being a big one, citizen-facing websites run by governments who are held to very high standards, accessing online medical records, doing online legal actions, etc. There are even many scenarios in the enterprise world. Employees of one company logging into the website of another company to, for example, be involved in a supply chain. Frequently, the large company supply chain would like to require the employees of the smaller company to be strongly authenticated to make sure there's no fraud in the supply chain. But it's hard for that large company to audit and know that the smaller company was doing a good job of strong authentication. However, if that smaller company outsourced it to a specialized and trusted authentication provider, the larger company might trust it. So then, assuming there are lots of websites who would be willing to pay, some amount of money per user per year to know that a user is strongly authenticated, who then might get in the business of strongly authenticating users? Well, one scenario is governments. Many governments around the world have experimented with this model, not with much success so far. In the US, United States, there's actually been a strategy letter signed by President Obama called INSTIC, which is the National Strategy for Trust Identities in Cyberspace, that basically states that the US government is not going to take on this role. So other potential companies to form this role would include online banks or consumer service providers, some of whom already do this for these users today. In addition, there are many companies, especially startups, who have tried to specialize just in providing strong authentication. The most of them have really only been successful so far in the enterprise space. And then a very specific group who is very good at this is mobile network operators, because not only are they good at authenticating people, they're good at authenticating devices, like the mobile phone in your hand that they know is associated with a specific phone number. So let's go through a couple of these potential authentication providers and talk about the pros and cons. So one of the first that commonly comes up is the idea that very popular consumer service providers like Yahoo, AOL, Hotmail, etc. Would do this, especially because they have deployed some stronger authentication mechanisms like one-time passwords. However, there are even more secure mechanisms that could be deployed than one-time passwords. And one of the questions is, would they actually invest in implementing those? Now, some of the advantages is, well, they have hundreds of millions of users for which, they could get strong authentication. However, most of them have very low adoption of their strong authentication means. And if these companies did choose to get in this space, they could charge websites, some fee per user per year to know that the user is strongly authenticated, and that model has the potential to take off. In fact, we're already seeing that some of these consumer service providers are playing multiple roles. They get your consent, they authenticate you, and some of them may know attributes about you, like your street address, phone number, etc. So another model is to use online banks. And in particular, there have been many experiments in the past in the United States and other countries of using online banks to authenticate citizens to government websites, or the same citizens, consumers, directly to non-government websites. One of their advantages, each of these online banks has huge numbers of users, and most of them already require all those users to leverage some strong authentication scheme. They also have things like help desk people can call, if they actually, have problems with this. One of the downsides, though, is people generally are not logged into their online bank on their browser. So if you went to a website and you wanted to log into it, well, if you're not logged into your online bank, then you're going to have to go through a login process, and the whole idea is to try to avoid that. Maybe this is solvable, but again, we're just raising some of the questions in this space. Another group we talked about are these specialist vendors, companies who might do nothing other than try to provide strong authentication and do it very well and do it very cheaply. As noted, been a long history of failures in this space. However, historically, there really hasn't been a strong market for them, not much money flowing. If a market was bootstrapped by other schemes, by other vendors in this space, it may all of a sudden, cause money to start flowing that then can bring in these vendors, and some of them may be successful. We'll see in time. But a very special group that we want to talk about is the mobile network providers. When we talk about these one-time password schemes used by companies like Google and Facebook, generally they involve sending a code to a user's phone. So there's already a reliance on the mobile network as a second factor of authentication. But the mobile network can do that more cleanly. They already know, what device is associated with what user. They know who owns that device and what the account is. So they don't need to do things like send a code to a phone to find out it's the phone associated with the phone number. It's sort of circular logic. In addition, they have the ability to take advantage of a very low-level security geeky details, the fact that there are certificates associated with the phone, or at least a device ID that's hard to fake. And that can be used to get even stronger authentication than you can get from just these one-time code mechanisms. So on the pro side, they have hundreds of millions of users. They're already mapped to device today. And while they don't have a lot of people using OTP today, that's generally because they have a better mechanism. So because they're so good in this job, well, then the question is, where is the money in it for them? And certainly, as we've said, there may be websites out there, and we gave some examples, who are willing to pay a fee per user per year to find out that the user is strongly authenticated. Of course, then that raises the question, how much to charge? Some websites might be willing to pay more than others because of the value it offers. How then would these mobile network providers maximize the revenue that they gained? Is a question. But let's say for a moment, a mobile network provider decides to take on this role. What would it mean? What would be the experience, for the user? So, one example that we will give, is a user, goes to a mobile phone store, purchases a new phone, or maybe does it online. Now, one of the problems is with all these smartphones, we expect them to do a lot. We expect them to already have our address book, our email, our photos, etc. But generally speaking, when you first turn on your phone, well, it's not associated with your account, so you have to go through some generally painful process of trying to type with your fingers on the tiny keyboard your email address and your password. Of course, you have to remember that information, and if you're at a phone store, you may not remember things like your password, or you might not even know whether you have an account associated with the email or calendar service. So there are a lot of problems that users encounter just when they've turned on a new phone and want to connect it to the cloud. So one of the ideas is to solve both those out-of-the-box problems for the new phone as well as these authentication problems, to solve them all together. For example, imagine when that user ordered their new phone online. In this case, the carrier was MobileX. MobileX might notice, oh, you have an email address with Google, or some service over there. And it'll tell the user, hey, with your permission, we can link your MobileX account to your Google account, and it will make it much easier when you turn on a phone. It'll be immediately connected to your account. We'll help you log in invisibly to websites, and we'll do so with strong security. And we'll even, in some cases, for some users, be able to give the user the option to assert their verified street address to sites that need to know it. So assuming the user does say that, all of a sudden we've solved a whole bunch of potential problems. The user is strongly authenticated, and there's an additional revenue stream for the mobile provider. There's also, for many cases, the mobile provider will be able to provide a verified street address for the user. Again, another revenue stream for the mobile provider for any websites that need that information. Next is it reduces the help desk costs and just paying for the user of the initial out of the box syncing process. And one of the things it potentially means that the mobile provider doesn't have to work on is that relationship manager page we showed before. That work may still be able to be dumped on another company who has to deal with all of that other complexity that doesn't generate money. So if you're interested in learning more about how that might work, I would suggest you refer to some of the other slides and video sessions from the conference shown at the streetidentity.com working group site, and in particular to go through the follow-on sessions to this one that talks about the specific details about how attributes can be exchanged between an attribute provider and a website, but in addition with money flowing, and then how we could build upon that to support these ideas of mobile providers and others providing strong authentication. Thank you.